So I'm recording again. Okay.
Yeah, that um, moment in your last remark, I think, let's see if I can do it correctly,
Hmm.
with regard to, obviously religious studies, mysticism, where does Beckett fit in some of this? But also,
Hmm.
I like and appreciate, this is a really good guiding point with regard to Beckett, is that you just simply not, you're going to fail if you're going to try and put him in some sort of camp or claim him for some sort of school of thought or
Yeah.
theology. It's not going to happen. But nonetheless, he seems to invoke theological discourses, even if just for the purpose of smashing them. So where does theology fit in this? Um, well, it fits in that sort of munching process, um, that it needs to be shattered and broken and kind of redone, rethought, perhaps even exhausted. And I'll come back to
Hmm.
that with regard to eschatology in a moment. But just very quickly, with regard to what Beckett himself said, he said, "Look, I use Christianity because I was brought up this way. I use its aesthetic structures." So when people tried to pin him down, in fact, and sort of tried to get some sort of semi-theological confession out of him, for example, with Godot. So Godot can't but fail to raise the idea of God, right, in that play. But he says, look, it's got nothing to do with God. And he refused to be pinned down on some of those points, even though his work, his aesthetic structures are drenched. You could almost say drenched in Christology, certainly drenched in references to Christ, references to God, are absolutely all through his work.
Hmm.
He would, and so if you like, there's this ongoing argument with theology all throughout Beckett's work, and it's inside his aesthetic structures. So there's this hidden Christ symbolism all throughout a play like Endgame, for example. You have to look hard for it, in fact,
Huh?
but it's there, and you can find it at various levels of his drafts as well. But he would stop short though and say, it's kind of my upbringing, it's kind of in me. So
Hmm.
yes, of course I use these structures, if you like, these religious structures, in my work
Hmm.
because I was brought up this way and it's there. But that doesn't don't draw from that some sort of
Hmm.
Christian confession, or that I believe in God or any of that sort of stuff. That's your stuff. If you want to interpret this
Hmm.
in theological terms, that's on you. Don't look to me for the answers. So I'm not, he kept pointing back to the work and the
Right.
uncertainty of the work. You make sense of these things. And I kind of like that gesture, in fact. Take responsibility for your own theology. Don't claim me for your camp.
Hmm.
You risk that interpretation and that idea of his work being theological or not theological. And it's going to provoke wider ideas
Hmm.
about point, purpose, meaning, whether they're secular or religious or theological. But that will be on the interpreter.
Okay.
Does that does
Yeah,
that
it makes sense.
does that make sense?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so in other words, he said he made aesthetic kind of uses
Got it.
of religion that are in his kind of structures, his aesthetic structures, which are self-negating sort of structures of various kinds,
Yep.
that end up provoking theological questions or negatively theological questions. But he would go back to the fact that, look, it's an artwork, it's a play, it's a poem, it's not a treatise, it's not a confession, it's a play. And I've created certain sort of structures, which, as I said, are kind of negative or self-canceling sort of structures. So in other words, there'll be anti-narratives in his work, that will unbind
Hmm.
resolution, that won't have clear results. And it's exactly that provokes these. It's exactly that structure that provokes these kind of bigger philosophical and theological questions. So that, if you like, is almost an aesthetic point for him. And
Yeah.
that seems to some people a cop out. It's like, here he is talking about God repeatedly and invoking all these questions, but then when you ask him about his position, he won't give you an answer. But he won't say, he doesn't give a clear atheistic answer either. He just gives this complete, absolutely genuinely agnostic kind of answer that keeps putting it back on you. Well, what do you think? Because I don't know.
Hmm.
I haven't got a clue. And I don't think we can know. He'll keep coming back to that ignorance, that fundamental ignorance. We simply can't know.
Hmm.
There'll be an urge to know, and we can't even overcome that urge. And that's part of our torture in a way, is that we are constantly reaching for a wider theological, redemptive answer that would make sense of all this. but we never can be satisfied that we've got it or that we can get it. Does that
Yeah, but
sort of?
why do you think it does that? So
He does that, I think, because it's being true to the nature of experience. Because ultimately, he's an artist, and that there's the
mhm,
experience I'm talking about here as well is let's call it an experience of radical uncertainty and
yeah.
the anxiety and pain and difficulty that comes along with that.
Mm.
So he's trying to be true to that kind of nature of contemporary experience, and that's what he'll come back to. And to offer an answer
Yeah.
would betray that experience.
Yeah, no,
Does that make sense?
absolutely. I mean, I'm I don't want to give away too much about. I won't make this about me, but and
No, look, it's
I'm no
more
bigot.
interesting than
But I
making it
mean,
about me, I'll tell you.
no. I mean, I feel like I should say like in the sense. I mean, I think I've said this on the podcast before. I am religious. Um, and I'd like to I'd like to say in a deep and meaningful way. Um, but and I am very fond, very fond of thinkers, contemporary and historical, deep into the past and more present, that are closer to us, that are honest about the shortcomings, um, limitations of our understanding.
Mm.
Which is why I love Eckhart, for instance. I really find the mystics attractive, and even though I understand that statement, that sort of wording, that the title itself, the mystics and mysticism is problematic. It's in a way it's a bit of a cop out too. It's like you can claim I'm a mystic. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
what does that mean?
Yeah.
And of course, there's all sorts of deliberations about the Sufis that I talk about too, in terms of are they mystics? And what do they mean when they use that term? And the terms are all different because Arabic and Persian come into it, and what words they use and how that correlates to the German or English understandings of our or Latin understandings or Greek understandings of that terminology, similar to corresponding words. So there's all these problems, but I find myself drawn again and again, and I always have, because I grew up in a very religious country. I was born overseas in Iran and raised here by very liberal parents. But in a sense, for me, establishment religion has always been a problem.
Mm.
Like as in I've viewed it with suspicion because of politics, because of
Good place to start. Yeah.
so I couldn't
Yeah.
I was thrown into that, to use Heideggerian terms. It wasn't a choice I had.
Mm.
So I wasn't I didn't grow up thinking about religion as a rosy colored lenses, in a sense, if that makes sense. Did I
Yeah.
say that
Yeah. No, it does.
metaphor right?
Yeah.
You know, so suspicion, in a sense, it's been a big part, and also criticism and skepticism and questioning, and why. So, and it's true. Like this is the thing. So I'm fascinated by Beckett. I appreciate what he's doing, so when you say like, so he's essentially, I mean, so I don't call myself an atheist, but I'm incredibly critical of religion, religious establishment, religious institutions, religious, you know, foundations, pillars, all of it. I mean,
Mm.
everything, nothing is beyond scrutiny, in a
Mm.
sense. But yet I find myself deeply immersed in a profound religiosity that I can't explain.
Mhm.
And I don't know what that is. And
Yeah.
from at risk of saying mystical,
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, there is that kind of thing.
No, I think it's probably enough to
Um,
just say
but you know where
that I'm
I'm
drawn to certain writers who are
right.
sometimes called mystics.
Yeah.
And you're right about that term. I think it can become, again, like any term that's been in the vocabulary for a long time,
Mm,
it can get attributed with certain kind of established meanings
mm,
that actually underplay, underrate, and just miss, let's say, for example, the radicalism of Eckhart. And
mm,
they don't realize just how um, profound and willing to put established ideas on the line, a thinker like Eckhart was.
Yeah.
And they haven't spent enough time going back to that context. Instead, they just associated with, I don't know, 6 centuries of boring established religion. I mean, this is just not even coming close to what Eckhart was doing and trying to do. Not that I don't know much about that. Beckett did make jokes about being St. John of the Crossroads, right? So he made jokes about some of the mystics as well. But I think that's a good place to start as well. Don't think because there was a church type character in the 13th century that he was like your local pastor or worse, your local bishop, right? Some established hierarchical figure. No. This character was an advanced thinker who was putting a lot. His ideas are about facing up to radical uncertainty. And how we move forward. Look, he did, as I said, he did read and was drawn to characters like Eckhart. I'm just trying to think of some others that he read. And what we know, he read bits of St. John of the Cross. And again, I think there's the moment. I'm guessing that some of the moments that he found in those writers can't necessarily be codified in some sort of dogmatic theology.
Yeah.
There's an experience though.
Yes.
That Eckhart's talking about. So just with regard to some of that stuff, the thing you talk about sort of religion and how your thinking is drawn in this way. To me, if you think about some of these things, it's not like there's this thing called religion and you sign up to it or something. As you say, it's more like being born into it. And you suffer some of it, in fact, and you have to make sense of some of it. So even if
into it,
or you fall into it, or you return to it, and you try to
reject the idea of being born into religion. Fall into it is how I would put it.
Yep.
Carry on.
Yep. In other words, you're stuck with a certain kind of clutter that you've got to make sense of or not. Either you reject it, and you can reject it and take some sort of various atheistical stance or not, and that's fine. There's no prejudice against which position you take in the end. But for Beckett, to me, if you're going to attribute him with any stance at all, it's a complete and utter and quite consistent agnotology or what's the in-between term in theology, the fence-sitting term, agnosticism. It's as close as you can to a kind. If we're going to peg him with something, if we feel we have to, it would be agnosticism. And there are jokes about agnosticism, of course, being about being on the fence, right? And there's a very funny early story of his called Echo's Bones, where the character's stuck in a kind of purgatory. And where is he? He's on the fence. And he's just stuck on this kind of fence. And he lives there on this fence of not knowing.
Right.
Because once again, to claim to know, and if atheism, to the extent that atheism is a claim to know something, a claim to know something about the nature of the limits of knowledge is already claiming a knowledge that you don't have or can't have. So in other words, you're claiming a certainty about the nature of knowledge that you can't actually have. So that's why agnosticism is not a fence sitting. It's the more honest position, the not knowing. I ultimately don't know. There's this much I know, and there's this explanation, and I'm willing to entertain all of them, but they don't seem to explain everything.
Yeah.
And so we keep coming back to the limits, the finitude, the contingency of the very structures of human knowing, which are ultimately finite, but keep coming up against the infinite, or, for want of a better word, a kind of absolute that might be outside or beneath, or our mind will go there, even if it's to say, well, there's nothing beneath it all that makes sense of it all. It's just not there. But our mind will need to be satisfied that it's answered that question one way or another.
Sure. There is this I guess uncomfortableness about what Beckett's saying for me personally, but and I understand that that's part of the unsettling of the grounds upon which often many falsely stand. They think they stand on solid ground, but they don't really. So I like that aspect of Beckett, which resonates with me through points of reference, which I've mentioned in Sufi literature. But there's a part of Beckett that I feel like it makes me push back onto him. And I'm having this argument with a ghost, not with you.
Yeah.
Um, and and that's the part where I feel like the agnosticism is a bit also curious in the sense that it is honest. We don't know, but in a way, it's in a way, and this is a very mild, and it's coming from a place of great ignorance because I'm nowhere near qualified to say anything about Beckett, so you're going to have to guide me here. But in a way, I feel like there's I'll use this word, you correct me, misrepresentation of theology and religion in a way, in the sense that, well, yes, like you said, that the sort of popular piety, naive belief stands on shaky grounds, really, but they think they're standing on the most solid thing. Um, and that's just, in a way, their foolishness, right?
Mm.
Their ignorance
Mm.
or arrogance. Um, and and that I can relate to that, and I can totally agree with Beckett on that. But in a sense, there is a deeper religiosity, a religiosity that's beyond intellectualization, rationalization. Um, Somewhat like my Atta,
Mm.
who is more about experience.
Mm.
And I know that's also a problematic category in the sense of, the experiences that we have, the subjectivity of our being, um, and the relationship of experience to intelligence, intellectualization, rationalization. So, but I feel like there is this kind of um, a problem that he creates, maybe deliberately, to poke. And I look, my general understanding of Beckett is essentially that he's trying to, in a way, shake people into realization. Yeah, to wake up. Like, don't walk around with this blindfold and just, you know, I mean, you can. I mean, ignorance is bliss, so just enjoy your life, whatever. But
We'll make jokes about that.
but yeah, right. But yeah, there is this aesthetic about him, and he does this really well. He tells these stories and his narrators, and they kind of work towards yeah, unsettling the grounds that we think we stand solidly on. But yeah, is that a fair kind of pushback?
Yeah, well, I think this
Nothing.
is important for any individual interpreter.
Maybe that gives you,
Is some of that resistance.
yeah,
It's like, well, hang on, I'm not entirely satisfied with some of this, and that might make you return to Beckett
yeah,
to look for certain answers
right,
that you're comfortable with in the end.
yeah,
I don't think in the end. I mean, there's what the last line of his last play is "Make sense who may,"
mm,
and he's referring to the play. But he's also referring once again
does.
to everything, to all of his work, but
Yeah.
also to all of life. If you can make sense of it, that's great, and that will be.
Yeah.
I'm not going to mock it necessarily, unless it's pious and too certain, unless it's a false piety and based on a kind of certainty that I'll ridicule. But that again will be thrown back on you as an interpreter. And if you can confront all of this, and if you can confront all the bare particulars that don't necessarily add up to a life, there are days
Yeah.
that we're waiting to add up to a life, and they don't.
Yeah.
There's these stones of these moments that don't amount to anything more than just a heap of pebbles.
Yeah.
This is the heap paradox in
Yeah.
pre-Socratic sort of thought that, which has a religious version, by the way.
Mm.
And the religious version is toyed with by Beckett in William of Champeau. So the heap paradox is very quickly this idea that, our days or moments are like pebbles or heaps of dirt that don't add up to anything else. They don't even add up to a heap. But they're just a bunch of unrelated. They're just a bunch of kind of unrelated particulars that don't add up to a life, a meaningful pattern. Right? We might live in anticipation of certain facts that might somehow give that scattered set of particulars a larger meaning and point and purpose. Right? And there's our big, if you like, interpretive, religious, theological, but also secular, potentially, moment. What are those facts that would put all of these other particulars into an eschatological order, a point, purpose, and meaning.
Yeah.
That will then change those facts into something else. And the religious version of this is William of Champeaux, I think, who says, well, you know, if God, if you like, is in everything anyway, God's already in everything. So he's in all those particulars to start with, as it were, right? And so he's also in any kind of heap that you might use to make sense of things. But just quickly, the heap paradox is also this idea, basically, that ultimately there's no change. So therefore, there's no, in the atheistic version, there can be no redemption. So there can be no change to the fact that there are just these, so there's just accretions of facts over here and more accretions of facts over there. These facts ultimately don't change. They get swirled around, matter, like an atomistic universe. All these things are particulars that just swirl around. Any attempt to make sense of that, to unify that in some sort of a synthetic religious or philosophical structure, that's us. That's not there in that structure. And so once again, there's the frailty, if you like, of a lot of our speculative ends. We want them to be in that structure somehow for it to be meaningful and point and purpose, but we're the ones that are actually bringing that point and purpose and structure, and it's frail and finite and everything else. That's as good as we can do, if you like. And Beckett, I suppose, will remind us that you can do that. That's fine. But that's kind of you. And you're putting that on. You're using all this stuff to make a speculative remark, really, about the nature of certain facts that will change this order. And give it a point and purpose and meaning. And go for it, he might say. That's fine. But his narrators will look at any of those attempts with a certain skepticism, I suppose. That's not a very good answer to your question. I feel even talking about Beckett sometimes and plunges you into certain conversations that are going to make you unsatisfied,
So
unhappy about.
I feel like I was being a bit unfair because, in a sense, the other poet I mentioned, Hafez, does a similar thing. There's an aesthetic about him, and it's probably more so an aesthetic than anything else. And he doesn't really take the Sufi content in his poetry or the mysticism in his poetry really that seriously, because it's more about the aesthetic. It's very Beckettian in a sense. I mean, he's 14th century. This is a bit of an anachronistic comparison, but in that sense, he's kind of, in a way, taking the piss out of everyone and everything.
Beckett likes him already, I'd say.
Yeah, I would think so. And a lot of people love Hafez, who are not religious in particular, and find in him useful phrase, turns of phrase or statements, lines. And these kind of, so I get that, and I understand, and I think I was being a bit unfair because what Beckett's doing is creating this aesthetic. It's art, really, in a sense. It is. I mean, for Hafez, it's the poetry. That's the art. For Beckett, it's what he's doing. That's the art. His narratives, his literature, his plays, books, novels, whatever, poems, whatever he does. Sorry. So what grabbed me here was you said the relationship of art to truth.
But just in a quick response to this to the previous conversation that might help you a little bit. Look, theology is just, in this sense, a long inherited tradition, not just of thought, but certainly of thought that is trying to summarize, make sense of human experience. But it's also, you might think of as a response to an enigma. And it's one that we might be, you as a religious scholar will be familiar with a lot of the answers, with a lot of the approaches, with that are called theology. But if we think of it not as some sort of supposed certainty that's laying out a path and a pattern before we've actually experienced it, because that'll kill any kind of genuine encounter with these writers and thinkers, theological or not, straight away. The idea that there's a point and purpose that's laid out for us and God's got it all planned, that's going to kill it straight away. But if we instead think of theology as a response to enigmas and things that are unexplained and we want to explain and need to explain as human beings, that are in our experience, then theology is just a response to that. And so is other non-theological discourses of various kinds, or philosophies, or metaphysics, or whatever we want to point to. Does that
Yeah,
that's another way to think
I like it.
about theology, because I think a lot of people just think of theology as just this accumulated stock of prefabricated answers to things. And again, that will just no wonder people aren't interested in theology if that's the answer.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
So that's the resistance bit I think you were mentioning with regard to Beckett. If Beckett, I think you're kind of suggesting that Beckett's taking an easy target if he's just going at popular piety and prefabricated answers, because that's a kind of easy target. And that I think is a fair point to make. But back to,
I agree.
That's my attempt to answer your previous sort of point with regard to the kind of resistance that you feel to the negative moment in Beckett, I suppose, which is kind of relentless. And there are, I think every reader of Beckett's felt this. It's like, oh God, this is just getting too it's just getting too hard, too difficult, too negative, etc. And he has to have answers to this. Nonetheless, his structures, and particularly this one that you mentioned, the relationship between art and truth, he finds a kind of negative aesthetic set of structures that help him get at that relationship, the relation of art and truth. And in many ways, this is his terrain. So part of this essay was about, okay, there's theology over here and there's Beckett over here, and certain people have said that Beckett sort of can invoke certain theological discourses. Well, if you're going to have this conversation, you've actually got to do it on Beckett's terrain, which is, in other words, you've got to understand his art. You've got to understand his aesthetic structures and what he's doing and why he's doing them. And this is him coming to terms in many ways with the tradition of art too, and mimesis. As understood by the Western aesthetic tradition, which one way or another, particularly if you're going to talk about art with any kind of seriousness, invokes this idea of a relationship to truth. And we can talk about what truth is, and we can talk about truth of experience. Maybe we could even talk about truth as a kind of taken for granted reality, right?
Yeah,
that art provokes certain thoughts about, and or shows us in different ways, or makes us even just think about what the nature of our taken for granted reality is. And in that, we want to talk about a kind of truth of experience, and that art is trying to, in some ways, represent that. And then we have our term mimesis, right? The attempt to represent, to mirror, in some ways, not just experience, but a kind of truth of experience in some ways. And so in that ways, we can talk about art being about particular kind of relationship between these artificial structures that are art and some sort of idea that we might end up arguing about truth, right? So that's kind of there, and it's got all these different answers and all these different patterns and all these different styles that are passed down through history. And so even the novel, which starts out as this kind of it's a kind of thing that we're probably familiar with, it has these narrative patterns and structures. It starts out as a form of flippant entertainment, but it gains serious respectability in the 19th century, particularly with writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, the Russians.
Yeah,
and it's making, even before then though, but it's making a particular kind of aesthetic claim about the nature of experience and the ability of the novel to capture, perhaps even to capture the altered nature of experience in modernity. And this is Lukash's theory of novel, that in fact the novel is actually all about a kind of absent God. A God starts with Cervantes, right? We've got this the certainty of a kind of guaranteed reality that we had in a medieval theological kind of structure is gone. And it ain't coming back. And in fact, the novel is this kind of newly developing kind of narrative, a kind of comic narrative that copes with or addresses this kind of new altered nature of reality and modernity. And so, okay, we go from century to century, and there are certain patterns, ideas about character, ideas about plot, ideas about narrative resolution that become the basis of the modern novel. Well, Beckett's going to go to work on those inherited structures.
Yeah.
And he's going to particularly go to work on the unifying or synthetic ability that they have. So a narrative a character, a plot, that they kind of create certain symbolic unities that make sense of a set of particulars. So everything we've been talking about to this point in the conversation, he's going to do the same thing with art and aesthetic. So if we have a symbol, if we have a narrative structure, even a unity of action in a play, he's going to attack that.
Right.
And he's going to undo it. So in many ways, Godot is a classic example of attacking the three Aristotelian unities: the unity of action, the unity of character, and the unity of time. And Beckett's going to go to work on those three things. They're the aesthetic structures that he negates. And he's going to still somehow, he runs the risk of being anti-art, like just so thoroughly demolishing these inherited symbolic structures that it's not art at all anymore. But he still manages, and this is the extraordinary thing, he still manages to make it art.
Okay.
And that's his achievement, to so thoroughly negate these aesthetic structures without ending up as some sort of, I don't know, cheap surrealist sort of gesture that says all art's just nonsense. He manages to be faithful to this experience of radical uncertainty we're talking as well. So it's all conducted aesthetically in that regard. But it's also a process of negation. And this is the weird thing when you read him. There's this weird, like his narrators are constantly undermining the usual unities of narration. So they'll doubt themselves, and they'll talk for a moment about, I don't know, a sheep down the road. But was that a sheep? Was that a noise? Or did I make that up? And so they're constantly self-undercutting themselves, and undercutting with that the unities. You can imagine these things are the aesthetic equivalents of the concept, or any unifying speculative intellectual device that unifies a set of particulars and gives them sense. Whatever the complement of that is in art, and I'll just use the example of the three Aristotelian unities, Beckett will undermine them, undo them. And there's that's how he creates these uncertainties that we're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense. Tell me about the shape of the idea. This is the other thing you have.
Yeah, this is a phrase of his. That what matters is the shape of the idea, not the content. So again, this brings us back to this aesthetic point that we're kind of talking about.
Yeah.
And in many ways, this is a simple point, at least for a lot of artists. Artists, as you'll know, if you ever sit down and talk to them, they're only ever talking about forms. They're talking about this and about that, and they're talking about in practical terms about their paints, about their sound, about the sounds that they're making, their music, or about how they put together their narratives, their stories. It's only at the end that they might talk about content, because they know that content, if you like, is an effect of these structures, and that too has a certain uncertainty, and interpreters will make of it what they will. Willem de Kooning, the abstract artist, said content is very, very small. It's really small. It's almost nothing. Right? It's tiny. And yet, as interpreters, as spectators onto the art, we're talking about it, we're obsessing about it, we magnify it, and we say it means this or it means that, and that becomes our kind of interpretive moment. But for the artists, their concern is the shape, the structure, the aesthetic structure, this relationship, if we want to go back to it, this mimetic relationship between these artificial structures and this weird sort of game that artists are playing with these artificial structures and its relationship to a potential truth or to reality. That's the thing that they're obsessing about.
Okay.
And that is all shape. That is all form, right? So again, think of a poet. All they care minutely about meter, sound, these tiny little things that don't concern the reader at all.
Yeah.
But they're absolutely fundamental to how the poem sounds and to whether or not it will echo or vibrate towards some sort of idea of a human truth of some kind. So the shape of an idea is what matters to him. So I'm going back to that point about Christianity and theology, and Beckett saying, well, I use these things because I was brought up this way. In other words, I use them aesthetically. So if you're finding godlike figures or deiform and cruciform structures throughout all my work, it's aesthetic. So don't try and sign me up to some sort of theological extra artistic truth, because all I know is what I've got here with regard to the art I was trying to make.
That's what he's working with.
And there's again that negative withdrawal process. In many ways, he's showing solidarity with his artwork at this point, saying it doesn't promise anything more than what it offers. And what it offers is that I don't know gesture. So it's quite minimalist in a number of ways, and quite spare, and again, that gesture of sort of pulling back. So for him, it's the shape not the content of the idea that matters most. This is a point that he'll come back to repeatedly. I think I put it a bit differently in the article about just how fundamental that idea is to his kind of aesthetic thinking. But I think it creates some of these effects we're talking about, some of these, some of our interpretive responses and our reaching for more than. We're still not really satisfied, if you like. And there are times, going back to your point about resistance, there are moments when I was reading Beckett as well, it's like, oh, hang on a minute, that feels a little bit like a cop-out just to say it's just art and it's just aesthetics. It's like, oh, hang on a minute, you're provoking all these questions through these structures you're doing it to now retreat and just say, oh, look, it's just art, it's just aesthetic structures, can feel like an unsatisfactory answer.
I'll tell you why, probably a little bit later, I'll tell you why I said that. And I've had lots of conversations with people, including with members of my own family, about these issues of religion and these objections to religion. There's a lot of them. I've had a lot of conversations with atheists and agnostics and religious people as well. But in particular, the objections I'm very familiar with. So here you've got in Beckett, God can no more come to expression than the self, making the connection between the two impossibilities all but inescapable. Now, I love the way you've written that the shape of that, it is beautiful. In fact, a lot throughout your paper, the way that you write, obviously, you are a literary scholar, so that really comes across, and I loved reading your work. So not just for the content, but just for the sound of it in my own head as I was reading. Explain that to me in terms of Beckett. God and self.
Yeah. So it's funny, actually, just in answer to that, that point about shape is that Beckett makes you think about your shape.
Okay.
When you read him as well, and when you go to respond to him, I think as a critic,
great.
You'll be. I mean, as you know, for every essay you write, there's a huge cutting room floor of stuff that you've just thrown out.
That's right.
And Beckett in particular, I think there's a big cutting room floor that I've got with regard to any essay that I've actually finally ended up going into print with.
Yeah.
And it's because he's so rigorous and authentic with his shape that he kind of, and minimalist, that he will stop you being kind of sloppy or easy in any kind of your interpretive responses. So I ended up thinking, and this is part of literary criticism too, you want to give a sense of what his sentences and feel like and what reading him feels like. And so you want to give a bit of that in your response, in your kind of intellectual responses to his work. But with regard to that question, yeah, but look, for Beckett, the self is, again, a really curious entity in Beckett, because for one way or another, and it's partly his philosophical influences, particularly his reading of Arnold Herlig's, we can know nothing about the self. And we'll work together cobble together various ideas, illusions, whatever else about who we think we are, or what substance we think lies beneath the tide of events and happenings and whatever else. But for Beckett, the nature of the I in particular is really unknowable. And there's this weird connection, in fact, between that unknowability. In many ways, it's haunting. It's kind of inhabiting you.
Yeah.
I don't want to use the word unconscious, but it's somewhere inside this weird thing that's kind of you that is unknowable. And there's a connection between that unknowability, and I'm not very good at explaining it, but there seems to be in Beckett a connection between that unknowability and this wider thing that we've been struggling to talk about in theological or other sort of terms, nature of reality that can't be known, at least can't be known in an absolute sense. So it's something about the unconditioned nature of reality that our mind might want to think about, but in the conditioned forms of our knowledge, we're never actually going to be able to adequately answer. There's some connection between that unknowability and a kind of I or self in Beckett. And again, it's just it's this thing that he will keep coming back to, this I that is me but is not me, that's nagging away at each of his narrators, particularly in this middle period and his final work, The Unnameable. The unnameable in the end, it could be, again, it brings up negative theological ideas about the nature of a kind of God as some sort of unnameable ultimate reality, but it's also a reference to a kind of self or I that seems to be somehow hauntingly inhabiting me, that I can't name, that I can't explain fully, and is somehow deeper than any kind of personal biographical self. Again, I feel like I'm floundering trying to talk about this sort of stuff.
It's fine.
I just I find that he provokes these kind of this kind of floundering in response to him, and again, you never feel like you've adequately answered the itch, the metaphysical kind of itch that he's gone and provoked in you by reading him. But once again, it's that, I suppose it's that struggle or effort to do so that is about the only meaningful thing here. That's good name.
The mention of God, is that just, again, like the shape of the idea, or is there something meant to happen here when you explore God in Beckett in relation to the self, and both of them as impossibilities that are inescapable?
Yeah, it's again, it's this thing you can't kind of erase. You can try, you can want to get away from it, just as his narrators in many ways are cursing, damning, ridiculing God, both a metaphysical God and also a personal God who might be responsible for suffering. He's attacking that figure all the time. But it's the fact that he can't ever get past it or get beyond it, or at least not for very long, that it keeps coming back, that is this kind of nagging moment that creates a kind of and provokes these ideas about a kind of negative possibility of a reality or an absolute reality that is beyond our reach, that if it has a logic, it's one that we can't access or make sense of. It might be there. We can never know it's there. At least we can never know in the conditioned finite forms of it's the structure of the way we sort of function and work. And I want to rule it out, and I want to make fun of it, and I'm going to make fun of that person who says it's there, but it's like your mind will keep wanting to go, or drifting back to these ultimately metaphysical questions, I suppose, about the nature of the real, and also the nature of good and evil, by the way. These end up, these inherited questions about the distinction between truth and falsity, about reality and non-reality, and about good and evil are a kind of, in many ways, the perennial questions of metaphysics that keep nagging at us, that won't let us alone.
Yeah.
And this, for Beckett, these are also deeply humanizing. And this is the point. We're not going to get to the end of these questions, but the effort to do so is humanizing. And there's that very little, not much, that actually ends up being really, really kind of important. Because to deny them, to deny that we actually probably live on the edge of an unknowable abyss, is to claim certain certainties that can have that imply a whole different kind of ethics, a certain arrogance, a certain this, a certain that, a certain whatever, that we can also argue is very human, but probably not humanizing. And there's no, and in Beckett there's a humility, I think, as well, in this not knowing, an epistemic humility, which Kant can point to, I suppose, to some degree. Kant trying to rule out both skepticism and sort of dogmatic religion. With his idea of the three postulates, he's trying to sort of come up with the principle of epistemic humility. I think there's, we can't know the nature of the absolute. We can't know the thing in itself. And again, you can have a go all you like at Kant's idea of the thing in itself and say, oh, it's a silly, ridiculous idea. But Adorno gives a really interesting, which I talk about at the end of the article, account of the kind of block, as he calls it.
Oh, yeah.
Really a point here about epistemic humility, about non-identity, about the limits of our knowing, the limits of our knowledge of objects. And this, if you like, is beyond the reach of a kind of technological instrumental mastery. And it's in particulars, it's in things. And this is the part of the justification for Beckett's negative art. He's being true to that non-identity, that thing that escapes the reach of conceptual mastery.
Okay.
And there's a certain kind of humility in that gesture, I suppose.
So
once again, I haven't answered your question.
No. You're fine. You're fine. I mean, I do confess. I mean, reading Beckett, there are moments where I'm like, yeah, and then there's moments where I'm like, because I just want to kind of push back on it. But
yeah, there's a tug of war. That tug of war gesture, by the way, is an authentic approach to Beckett, and the dissatisfaction that it produces, because you want to answer these questions.
Well, it's not that I want an answer. It's I appreciate the gesture, and I appreciate the sentiment behind the gesture, that you need to figure it out for yourself. I'm not going to tell you, and the answer that you find most likely is not going to be the absolute answer. It may not be greatly satisfying, but it's something that you got to come to terms with, and you've got to understand for yourself, and then make your way and keep going. And until you come to that moment in yourself, then you don't really have a ground to stand on. You haven't really found your legs, your feet, or your own way. And I appreciate that deeply. If that's what Beckett is saying to me, then I love that. That's a great message. That's something I want to tell my children.
Yeah, and because but then the next question is, just for fun, let's ask this question.
Yeah, okay.
Is what why is that a good message? Or at least, what can you draw from that minimalism, let me call it that?
Yeah.
That, let's not call it consolation, but why is that a good message? Or why can we draw, what can we draw from that? And that is a kind of follow-up question, I think. And I was trying to answer that earlier with regard to humility, solidarity, but also a kind of resilience in the face of not knowing, in the face of anxiety, and just accommodating yourself to an unsatisfactory reality, or to pain, and to difficulty. And that there are things you can develop, a kind of toughness or resilience that you can actually, a stoicism perhaps, that you can that is both true to experience and to your experience, that you can extract from it. So there's a certain solidarity you can find in the words and experience of fellow sufferers, if you like, that we see on Beckett's stage, or in some of his novels. And this is where his humor becomes so important, this relieving. It's not totally relieving, and there's a certain pain in the humor, but the humor is a really important way of accessing these kind of fortifying lessons, if you like, that we can draw from the disappointments, pain, contingency, incompletion of life.
Yeah,
but that was me answering your question. So my question back to you was why is that a kind of a good message? That lack of certainty, that you can find in Beckett, that lack of consolation in a way. Why is that a message you want to pass on? Or
I wouldn't say, I probably wouldn't phrase it in terms of lack of certainty, and I would probably phrase it being a more positive personality. I would probably phrase it more like Yeah, it's just there's a degree of honesty and truthfulness about it, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a point. Sometimes the illusion of truth helps people move along in moments of pain or despair. Other times, and it depends, and you kind of know who you're talking to, who your audience is. And in a sense, this is another question I have about Beckett is to what extent is his context driving his work and who he is. And in fact, really all his work reflects him, even though he doesn't want to, and he wants to push it onto the reader. I would, at risk of psychologizing Beckett, I would say my instinct is to say, this is him. He's revealing himself. He's being vulnerable, and it's beautiful. Another point to which I praise Beckett and I love about him, um, the little that I know, I would say, if that's the case, vulnerability of an artist, of a thinker, of a person is one of the most beautiful things to me.
Yep.
As a person. I appreciate that greatly in people.
Yeah.
Or thinkers or think people I read.
Yep.
Ancient or modern, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and that's a really a good answer to that original question about why Beckett might be worth reading.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a
100%.
huge, yeah, he's putting a lot of himself in that regard on stage, as it were, his own weaknesses, pains, complaints, vulnerabilities. Yeah, and that's I suppose what I meant earlier about a certain kind of solidarity that you can draw from Beckett in the face that we might draw from Beckett in the face of pains, humiliations, uncertainties, anguishes. That gets back to that point about a truth of experience. So that earlier discussion we had about aesthetics, there's a sense in which the inherited forms of art, after a while, either lose pace with the contemporary experience or maybe even cover over aspects of it. And here come your innovators and your experimenters and characters like Beckett that say, okay, this ain't working anymore. This lovely resolved little plot of a 19th century novel is just not matching up with the speed, uncertainty, technological monstrosity of the world that we're living in now. We need new forms. And this was a key element of actual remark of Beckett's, actually, when he talked about why he wrote the way he did. We need new forms. It's a very modernist sort of statement in a way. Or justification for experimenting with inherited forms is they're kind of not keeping pace with the altered nature of, and perhaps accelerated nature of modernity. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's why there's a certain negativism to what I'm doing, is because these inherited forms we've got are actually blocking a truer representation of this nature of contemporary experience that I want to get at. That's why we need new forms. So that point as well about truth and authenticity is another way of coming to terms, if you like, with his negativism. Or which can get relentless. There's no doubt about it. In Beckett, it can get relentless, and you can throw it over your shoulder sometimes, thinking, "Oh my God, this is just too much." But it's also part of that honesty and authenticity that he'll never kind of let you off the hook.
And so he shouldn't. And I think any honest thinker should do the same thing. Not let his audience or her audience, their audience, off the hook, in a sense. I mean, there's a binary relationship. There's this kind of not to suggest separation, but there's interconnectedness between the author and the reader, the artist and the viewer. There's just something of in Heidegger I picked up on. He talks about art as well. I mean, there's a responsibility, but there's also a way of speaking, that the Beckett's doing. He's speaking to the audience in a way, relaying his own experiences, his own life, his own story, who he is, and then sort of being honest about that, and then asking the reader to also be honest about themselves in a way. So here I am putting myself out there, and now you do the same thing. So that's really nice. And I feel like as I was saying, I think it's a responsible thing to do. It's a genuine it's a virtuous thing. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a virtuous thing to do by any author, any thinker, to kind of push the reader into that direction. Um, but in a way, I feel like so. So this is where I kind of push back on Beckett's sort of. I mean, and see now I understand because you've explained it to me that for Beckett, religion, theology, given his context, his circumstances, um, his identity, is very much part and parcel of his materials for work. So this is what I understand what you've told me. And so that is almost coincidental.
Mm.
It could have been,
It's an accident of birth in that regard.
Yeah.
He could have been born in Persia in the 14th century. He would have different materials.
Exactly.
Yeah.
or in Japan or in Germany or whatever.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
In that sense, he's thoroughly European, and yeah.
But he's self-aware, and he's not falling into the same traps of repeating theological narratives and patterns of thought, um, in new forms, in new shapes, in disguised forms, I wanted to say, in disguised forms, in disguised ways.
Yes.
Right? You can see like for example, being, this is what I do, right? I can almost instinctively pick up religion in anything.
Yeah.
A movie I watch, I'm like, hey, there's a religious thing about that point there,
Yeah.
Or a novel, you read it and you're like, all right, this clearly has undertones of theology. There's the schema of, salvation, resurrection, or
Yep.
whatever the case may be. So it, it's interesting. And so I did a recent interview with a colleague of mine from Notre Dame, and we were talking about this Greek idea of katabasis, and I can never pronounce that right because I'm not Greek. That's my little Greek Persian joke that I always do best. So this idea of descent into Hades, underworld, theme, motif, going back to Gilgamesh, Sumerian myth, and then coming forward in time. It's ancient. And one of the things I love about Gilgamesh's story is that it kind of ends in a sort of flat, like there's no happy ending in a sense. It's like the message is accept life for what it is, live it to the fullest, and be grateful that you have it.
Yep.
And in a way, that has a sense in which you can pick up from Beckett, like in what he's saying. Is that
Totally.
correct?
And I'll talk about the catabasis in Beckett in just one second. I just want to go quickly back to that point you mentioned about his awareness of theological discourses. In some ways, he's not just avoiding them; he's exhausting them.
Okay.
So just the way he's exhausting certain aesthetic forms. There's a sense in which, with regard to sort of eschatology and an inherited idea of that strong theological discourse as there being a kind of final order to things that will make a kind of sense, he's not only going to avoid that discourse so much as exhaust it, run it into the ground. And this is the bit that feels like he's talking about meaninglessness, but it's almost like he's trying to exhaust it of meaning. There's a sense in which we have too much meaning. And here's the attack on established religion and inherited discourses. There's too much meaning. And in fact, it's used for all sorts of dodgy purposes to explain, to justify all sorts of manner of inhuman practices. And in fact, that's another reason why we actually need to exhaust these discourses. So we need to exhaust this inherited discourse of Christian eschatology, for example. He knows you can't, do it entirely because the very attempt is going to imply some sort of eschatological structure. But in the end, he's going to find ways to actually kind of break it down, and it's going to feel like meaninglessness and nihilism. But it's actually this process of exhaustion. And if we think of inherited meanings as potentially burdens of various kinds that are weighing us down, then that can offer a certain kind of satisfactory explanation about why he sees the need to exhaust these discourses in ways that are going to look like meaninglessness. There's going to be a point and purpose, an aesthetic point and purpose to that might provide certain kinds of genuine orientation in our lives, but we have to get past, if you like, or exhaust a lot of these prior patterns. And let's call them theological and philosophical and metaphysical. These inherited answers that are just not answering our experience at the moment anymore. So we need to exhaust that pattern. So that was
Yeah.
response to the previous point about how he's taking some of that stuff on. But back to your current point, and I probably made you forget what your current point was now. What were you saying a moment ago?
I was telling you about the catabasis.
Catabasis, that's right. Yeah. Look, as a kind of, and again, let's talk about this as a kind of aesthetic structure. I mean, he probably read Gilgamesh. There might even be a joke about Gilgamesh in his work. He certainly was very familiar with the descent into Hades.
Yeah.
And particularly where it hits him, of course, is with Dante. Right?
Yeah.
So he is, again, Dante was a very important poet for Beckett and all the modernists, in fact for Eliot. And in fact, there's some almost quasi-theological debates or differences or points of dispute that Beckett will have with Eliot's account of Dante. It's kind of funny in a way. But I think he was important for more than just those two. The modernists and any number of modernists have gone back to Dante and in a sense tried to provide new content for that, a certain kind of structure, metaphysical, theological structure that Dante's kind of given us or gave medieval thought. And one of them, of course, is purgatory, which in some ways, you tell me this, I'm not sure, is perhaps even an invention of Dante's. It's not really clear where in Catholic theology, it seems to me, where purgatory kind of we know it becomes a dogmatic point of the church, and Luther will this will be a point of dispute with Protestantism. But in some ways, it's Dante, the great sort of poet, more than just a poet, wasn't he? He was a thinker and he was in a sense, a theologian. He provides the Middle Ages in a way with a kind of picture of how the universe is, the theological or theocratic universe looks like. And purgatory ends up becoming hugely important for Joyce and for Beckett. Now they're going to shave off certain sort of theological answers or structures that Dante gives, but there's something about, and actually there's a book in Eric Auerbach talks about the relevance of Dante in the 20th century with regard to a certain kind of realism that's there in Beckett's work. We don't think of Dante in terms of realism because we think of this otherworldly sort of structure, but in fact, there's a structure of realism in Dante's work. There's a particular character in particular that Beckett seizes on, a guy called Balak-Washua. I've gone and forgotten which pouch of purgatory he's in. I think he's a character who, I should have looked this up before today's conversation, but there's a Balakwa, I think, is a very modern character in a way, who's kind of just indifferent. He's just too lazy to go backwards or forwards anymore, and he's just had enough. And he's just it's not despair as in that total despair. It's more this kind of indifference and just an exhaustion. And it's like, and I think Balakwa, you meet Balakwa and he's got his, he's crouched down, and he's got his hand over his head, and he's a oddly Beckettian figure now, Balak-Washua. And he takes that figure, and in many ways that his modern kind of anti-heroes are different versions of Balak-Washua, this figure from Dante. So he's going to take purgatory in particular, and perhaps hell as well, but certainly purgatories, as a structure in which to explain modern experience. There's probably no ascent to heaven, but there are purgatories in Beckett.
Makes sense.
That he uses that are so they cut off. You don't get the full catabasis. You don't get the descent and then exit. You don't get the exit part, but you certainly get the descent that you stay in. That is a kind of catabasis that we find all throughout Western narrative, that is very much drawn on in various ways in Beckett.
See, that makes a lot of sense in a way. Like I get that in a way. This probably maybe a socio-political point that Beckett might be making in terms of Ireland and its geopolitical situation. So it kind of makes sense that the modern world is essentially a purgatory. There's not even a weirdly deformed one, because there's no up and there's no down. There's no going, as you said, there's no progressing and there's no
backwards, no going forwards. Yeah.
So we're kind of stuck like that figure.
Like Balakwa, yeah. Totally. And it's very
And
much
so this is the
a moment.
commentary, perhaps, on the state of the fate of modernity, state of affairs, the fate of modernity, the modern man. You know, we're all standing in the supermarket with a billion choices for toothbrushes. Which one do I choose?
Yeah,
And it's almost you're wasting 10 minutes of your life trying to figure out which one.
yeah.
Choice is a great thing. Don't you love it? You know, but I just want a toothbrush.
That's right.
So what do I do here?
Yeah, yeah.
You spend ages reading and trying to figure out.
That's right. It's like we're lacking a choice inhibitor because
There's the
we'll be
perfect word.
overwhelmed by this multitude of desirable choices that we end up being paralyzed by them. And yeah,
Paralysis. Yeah, this is kind
there
of
is a
intellectual, spiritual, perhaps religious paralysis.
there is a figure of paralysis, I think, in Beckett, not just in Beckett too, in John Darth and other writers, where we kind of overcome or paralyzed um, by the waves, or in this case, to use the example you're talking about, the multitude of desirable choices, in which there's no way of making a distinction between one choice and another. And there's a lovely medieval figure for this point I'll just mention quickly, which is Burdin's ass. So John Burdin, the medieval theologian, comes up with this thought experiment about the donkey stuck between two identical bales of hay, and there's no reason for choosing one bale over the other because they're both perfectly identical. And what happens to the donkey? Well, the donkey dies of starvation. And that situation of Burdin's ass is one that there's no reason for going forward. There's no reason for going back. There's no reason for going left. There's no reason for going right. This is a joke that Beckett will make in Blackwishua's progress, in inverted commas, across Ireland. So he can't even walk out the door without being overcome by this kind of sort of paralysis. He ends up against this statue in downtown Dublin where he's just leaning against, a bit like Blackwishua down in Purgatory, just leaning against this monolith in London, just not being able to make sense of forward, backwards. It lost all orientation.
So is this a critique we can make of Beckett? Is he creating this kind of paralysis, or is this an intentional commentary that he's making about the paralysis of our life?
I think for him, I think initially I'll go quickly.
Is he himself experiencing this paralysis?
Oh yeah. No, if we want to go biographical, I was going to say I'll
please.
quickly running to the aesthetic explanation, because he uses this as a kind of aesthetic. There's this idea of lack of progress, lack of causality, he'll not be able to make connections, and he'll develop a non-relational sort of art out of all of this. But yes, just to get to it biographically for a second, absolutely it was. There's lots of jokes of him as a young man, and being, he probably did have, I don't know, maybe he did have mild depression of some kinds. He certainly was pessimistic in some of his outlook. There's no doubt about that, I think. And he was drawn to Schopenhauer as a pessimist in this.
Yeah.
But there are lots of jokes actually about him sort of, he called himself Oblomov as a young man, which is a famous character from a 19th century Russian novel who can't get out of bed and basically runs his affairs from the bed. He's got all these serfs on this property in Russia. He just never gets out of bed, and he can't see any reason to. And it's like he just couldn't be asked, And Beckett makes jokes at one point about, sitting on his backside and just not wanting to get out of bed and not wanting to, as a young man, sleeping in and being the despair of his parents. And this lasted into his sort of 20s and 30s, and a profound sense of ennui or indifference was definitely part of his temperament, I think. And this is part of the struggle to actually do even the smallest things that comes across in some of his narrators. What's the point? And in fact, what's the point of going left or right, or the distance between A and B? And you'll use sort of these sort of almost geometrical bare sort of terms to create a sense of pointlessness, of there being no difference between taking this option or taking that option. In the end, we've got to wait this thing out. We've got to wait out this thing in purgatory, if you're Blackwishua, or just even in modernity. We've got to wait and watch and endure, if you like. There's going to be no, inverted commas, progress. There's going to be no redemptive moment that changes everything we do. There's going to be a set of different disappointments. So doing this rather than that doesn't make any difference. And so this kind of inertia is something he tries to going to use a paradoxical expression, set in motion, but it's something he's going to put at the center of some of his narratives or anti-narratives in his work. Again, not a satisfactory explanation exactly, but again, yeah, let's give an aesthetic explanation. This is it's very much part of his personal experience. But I think he also sort of thought that this was not just me who's feeling some of this disorientation and indifference. And this is part of his authenticity. I want to get this, I want to find a way of giving expression to this. And in fact, the only way I can seem to do it is through this negative aesthetic way, this anti-narrative way, that is going to give expression to all this pain, uncertainty, inertia, difficulty, etc. There's no progress, there's no, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, I think we can find these. We can certainly find. I don't know. He was thinking about, modernity in abstract. We certainly wouldn't have been thinking about it in any kind of abstract ways. But I think we can find something characteristically modern about Beckett's reformulation of some of these old sources like Dante or like Herlex into a modern context of a certain kind of disorientation, confusion, and struggles, the term I keep coming back to when I think of his narrators.
Yeah,
struggling to make sense is this gesture that
so art reflecting reality sort of thing. He's trying to mirror in his work.
Well, that's it. And as we said earlier, though, that very idea of mirroring is a mimetic kind of structure that he's actually going to take down.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a colloquial sense, absolutely, he's going to try and give expression or representation or kind of reflect that reality. But he's going to do it in a way that is going to undo the reflective or representational structures or inherited representational structures of art, and that's his anti-art moment. So he has to go anti-art, if you like, anti-narrative, to get at this experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and I think that's part and parcel of his complexity. He's not just, that's what makes Beckett Beckett.
And he knew a lot about painting. He had a lot of painter friends. He had a lot of artistic friends. He knew a lot about music. So he knew a lot about these kind of different disciplines and draws on them in his work. There's lots of references to music, and there's lots of structural uses of music and pausing throughout his dramas and plays. So he's drawing on everything he can, and it's not just a knowledge of literature or these weird sort of medieval mystics. It's also his knowledge of contemporary art. He's following very closely what other artists are doing, and a lot of other artists are looking back to him as well, going, "Wow, what's this guy doing? What's Beckett up to? And so Beckett himself will have this enormous kind of influence, not just on writers or dramatists, but on musicians. And on painters. He himself will have this interesting, because he was so broad in his aesthetic interests and interested in what painters are doing and trying to understand exactly what painters are doing, trying to understand what musicians are doing, that they then, I think that feeds into his work and other, more than just writers, but artists more generally are drawn to Beckett. Because of all these, there are all these aesthetic questions that come up when you read his work.
I think we've had a massive conversation, actually.
I apologize.
No, don't be. I love it. I'm really enjoying. Time has gone by really fast, and I'm just conscious of that. But I'm thinking to kind of conclude our conversation, how would you talk about the value and the import of Beckett for us, just to leave our viewers, listeners with this thought?
Yeah.
Why should you take up Beckett?
Again, I'm not really very good at recommendations, but I'll find my way to one. It's funny, actually, as I was saying to you earlier before we started today, I feel actually a long way away from Beckett at the particular moment. I was positively obsessed by Beckett, and I think he lured me in. Like, this happens to a lot of us, doesn't it? A thinker, like some of the thinkers and poets you were talking about It happens with a lot of our aesthetic experience as well. We can get totally absorbed by an artwork, a thinker, and we actually want to kind of inhabit it. In many ways, that's a process of interpretation or hermeneutics. We actually want to inhabit the work in some ways, and to take it on. And to do that, we drench ourselves in reading about, thinking about, going along and seeing Beckettian artworks and seeing the world through some of these structures. I got a lot out of doing that, which was not just about, curating some sort of academic profile. These I found in Beckett, when I was positively obsessed by him, I found in him, inverted commas, answers to a lot of the nagging questions that I had that were not just aesthetic ones, but were metaphysical, contemporary philosophical questions that I found his characters, or I found weird, let me put it that way, weird kind of answers and responses to, which include non-answers and non-responses and confessions of inability to understand anything throughout his work. A weird kind of consolation. He would have hated the word consolation. It's certainly no easy consolation, but it's one that I think you can draw. Let me put it this way: you can even draw a kind of, again, it wouldn't have like this. You could draw a practical kind of knowledge or wisdom out of some of this stuff.
Yeah,
because it is his ability, I suppose, to absorb, or his narrators, to absorb what can sometimes seem like the most unendurable moments of mental anguish, of pain and suffering. Sometimes it might be heaped on the narrator themselves through their own sort of intellectual pursuits and whatever else, rather than terrible external or traumatic events that have happened to the narrator. No, this is just the treadmill of the mind that can lead us in the strangest directions, and can lead to lots of dissatisfaction, pain, discomfort, anguish. But going around that treadmill of the mind and adjusting to some of the disappointments and scenes that treadmill will take you on, getting used, in fact, to a kind of Sisyphean sort of pattern.
I'm glad you brought up.
Is one, or Balakwa, or any sort of purgatory sort of figure, is one that you can, I think you can learn to see as not just being a figure of despair. And of the darker moments, though, there's a little bit of consolation of the fact that there's a truth being told here about the nature of my pain, about the nature of this suffering, about the nature of this course through life, that can't be shrugged off, that can't be switched off, that to some extent life is a course of affliction and of pain and of suffering. And that doesn't mean, though, that we just pack it in or we capitulate before that. Although, funnily enough, Beckett will turn gestures of capitulation, of giving up, of falling over into a kind of inverse heroism. But that's part of the paradoxes of the progress of Beckett's wayfarers. But it's the way he can invert that and turn a kind of weakness into a weird kind of strength and resilience. It's that transmutation of what we think of what his narrators tell us is a kind of infirmity and weakness, and they're quite literally disabled sometimes. That he can develop a kind of through the progress of his narrators, or their lack of progress. There's a curious kind of strength, fortification in the face of difficulties. For one of us, a better way of putting this, a kind of stoicism, I suppose, that I think is worthwhile beyond any kind of abstractly philosophical question that you might have. In other words, to me, he really does in the end become a resource, because he can stare down nihilism. he actually becomes an enormous intellectual and emotional resource, I think, to help you actually stare it down too. And there's great solidarity that he's offering you with it. No bullshit, no lies, no fake consolation here, but you feel like he's linking arms with you to help you stare down this travail, this bizarre thing that which seems to get stranger with every year of our lives that we end up calling, for want of a better word, life.
I think that's a tremendously satisfying answer, at least for me. And I think let's end on that. And
I think it'll get worse if we go on.
Yeah, or better. God Bothering Beckett, the title of your article published in Literature and Theology back in 2020. And I think it still carries weight and significance, if I may say. So I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you for sharing it with me. Thank you for agreeing to coming on the podcast. And it's been a tremendous pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Milad, and apologies to all your listeners.
Don't be sorry.
That must have hurt. They're going to stick to the end. Hopefully they'll tune out very quickly. But for those of you who did stick around, my deepest apologies. I do hope through this whirligig of confusing answers and questions that you can draw something.
Or nothing.
Or nothing.
As Beckett would have it.
That's exactly right. It's more than nothing than you think.
Indeed. I love it. Okay, we'll leave on that paradox. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Milad.